Cal didn't open mail. He didn't speak to neighbors. He barely spoke to himself anymore. His world was silence, measured by the ticking of a wall clock and the creak of old floorboards. But the silence broke first with a child's drawing left on his porch. Then with paw prints in the snow. Then with a knock that never came, because the visitor didn't have hands, only a wounded heart and a dying life hanging from its jaw. Before we begin this unforgettable story, would you mind sharing where you're from in the comments? And if stories of love, loyalty, and second chances move you, please give this video a like and consider subscribing. The wind scraped along the frozen ridges of Elk Ridge, Colorado, like claws on glass. It was mid-January and the snow hadn't stopped in 3 days. Pine branches hung heavy with frost, and the road into town had been reduced to little more than a whisper under the layers of ice. Somewhere at 8,000 feet elevation, just past the tree line and tucked beneath the shoulder of Mount Greystone, sat an old A-frame cabin, weathered by years of solitude and silence. It belonged to Cal Morrigan, though no one in town had seen him in nearly a year. Cal was 43 tall, with broad shoulders that once bore the weight of entire rescue teams. Now those same shoulders hunched inward, like someone bracing for a blow that never came. His hair, once black and military short, had grown long and peppered with silver streaks. His beard was thick but well kept, and his eyes, a dull gray, had the weary glaze of a man who had stared too long into the face of grief. Cal had once been a celebrated wildlife vet, respected across counties for his work in both mountain rescue and rehabilitation. That was before the avalanche. Before Beth, before everything froze over inside and out. That morning, Cal had risen before dawn, not because of any alarm or intention, but because sleep often betrayed him. Wrapped in his old flannel coat and boots with cracked soles, he shuffled onto the creaking porch to retrieve firewood. That's when he froze. At the bottom of the steps stood a dog. No, not just any dog, but a golden retriever, perhaps 8 or 9 years old. His coat heavy with snow paws, caked in ice, and eyes glazed but alert. Clenched gently between his jaws was a much smaller form, a puppy limp and lifeless, its tiny legs dangling like wet ribbon. Cal stared, heart slowing in disbelief. The larger dog didn't move, only looked up, and there was something solemn in his posture, like a soldier reporting to the last man standing. Cal stepped down a single stair. "You lost?" he asked, his voice hoarse from disuse and mountain air. "Or did someone send you?" The retriever didn't flinch, didn't back away. Instead, he stepped forward and laid the puppy onto the wooden porch. Then, with a sigh that misted into the air like smoke, he sat. His fur was a dull, muted gold, muddy with time, patchy at the shoulders, and lined with old scars that told of long trails and fights not chosen. His muzzle was frosted with white, and his left ear had a notch missing, healed but rough. Cal knelt beside the small bundle, his knees cracking as he crouched. The puppy was barely breathing, if at all. A white-furred creature, likely just 2 months old, with ears too large for his head, and a faint tremor in his chest. Blood, thin and dried, streaked down from one paw. "I don't suppose you came from nowhere," Cal murmured gently, pressing 2 fingers against the pup's rib cage. There, faint, so faint it could have been imagined, was a flutter of movement. Boone, as Cal would later come to name him, sat perfectly still. It was as though he understood this wasn't just a doorstep drop-off, it was a plea. Cal picked up the pup, wrapping him instinctively in the hem of his coat. The movement came not from choice, but memory echoes of old rescues of trauma managed by routine. He nodded once to the old retriever. "All right," he muttered. "Come in, but don't chew the furniture." Inside the cabin was modest but clean. A fire was already low in the hearth, and the couch had become a graveyard of fleece blankets and folded laundry. Cal laid the puppy down, then turned to the cupboard for towels, a warm compress, anything. The retriever padded in behind him, leaving melted snow prints across the hardwood. He didn't sniff around, he didn't bark, he simply lay near the door watching. Cal worked in silence, his hands steady out of long habit until the pup let out the weakest of whines. That single note struck harder than any avalanche. Cal exhaled sharply, clutching the tiny frame tighter. Out on the porch, unnoticed beneath a blanket of wind-blown snow, sat a folded piece of paper. A drawing. It showed a large dog and a small one beside a campfire drawn in waxy crayon lines. Above them floated a speech bubble. "It's okay to be warm again." The paper was signed in looping blue ink, Junie Bell. Junie Bell was a girl from 3 cabins down the ridge. Though cabins was generous, her family lived in an old prefab trailer insulated with prayer and tacked-on plywood. 9 years old and relentlessly curious, Junie had been raised by her grandfather after her mother died from pneumonia the winter she turned 5. Since then, she'd become something of a silent friend to the forest, and lately to Cal. Junie had made a ritual of leaving her drawings on his porch: bears in sweaters, foxes with books, dogs building igloos. She never knocked, never spoke, but Cal always noticed. He never responded. But this one was different. He stared at the drawing for a long moment, then folded it carefully and placed it beside the pup. "His name's not mine to give," Cal whispered, "but if you're staying, you'll need one." The old retriever, still near the door, flicked his tail once in slow approval. "Boone," Cal said, looking at him. "You look like a Boone." Snow began falling again outside, heavy, relentless. But inside that old cabin on Elk Ridge, the fire began to burn just a little brighter. The wind had quieted by morning, replaced by a thin mist that floated like breath over the snowdrifts. Cal Morgan stood at the kitchen window, his hands wrapped around a chipped enamel mug, watching the frost inch along the glass from the corners like creeping ivy. Inside the cabin, the air was still heavy with the faint scent of smoke and pine sap. On the couch, nestled into a cocoon of blankets and one of Cal's old flannel shirts, lay the puppy. Its tiny chest rose and fell in a rhythm so faint that Cal checked twice just to be sure he wasn't imagining it. The larger dog, Boone, had not moved from his place near the cabin's entryway. He lay stretched out on the wooden floor like a silent sentry, his breathing steady, his eyes half-lidded but never fully asleep. Boone didn't fidget or whine. He didn't scratch or beg. He merely existed in the room as though he had always been part of it. The fire crackled faintly behind the grate, casting the room in a warm, amber hue that seemed to soften the edges of everything it touched. Cal had no illusions about what he was doing. He wasn't a vet anymore. He hadn't touched a suture needle in nearly 4 years, hadn't opened a textbook or attended a consult. He had turned away from it all after Beth's death, after the mountain swallowed her whole beneath a sheet of white. He couldn't even bring himself to talk to her parents after the recovery team had brought back only a scarf and a broken compass. That kind of loss didn't just bend a man, it burned straight through him, hollowing out everything soft, until all that remained was the structure of who he used to be. But looking at the pup, this tiny frostbitten thing lying still yet stubbornly alive, Cal felt something stir beneath the debris. A muscle memory, an instinct, a sense of duty that no amount of grief had ever truly extinguished. He set the mug down, crossed the room, and knelt beside the couch. The pup's eyes fluttered briefly before closing again. Its paw, the one with the dried blood caked around the dew claw, twitched slightly. That was enough. Cal began unpacking the old first aid kit he had shoved to the back of a kitchen cabinet years ago. Most of the items inside were expired or stiff with age, but there were still things he could use. Alcohol wipes, a thermometer, tweezers, a few remaining syringes clean and capped. Boone lifted his head as Cal began to work, but didn't move otherwise. Cal spoke in a low murmur as he cleaned the blood from the paw, checking for punctures, frostbite, or worse. "You're a stubborn one," he muttered. "That's good. You'll need it." There was a quiet knock at the door. Cal paused, glancing up confused. Few people ever made the trek up the ridge, especially not in winter. He opened the door just enough to see the familiar knit hat and oversized red coat of a small girl, Junie Bell. She stood with her arms wrapped around her own shoulders, cheeks pink with cold, her long brown hair escaping from under her hat in frizzy curls. In her gloved hands was another piece of folded paper. "I didn't mean to bother," she said quickly, eyes wide. Just this one felt important. Cal didn't say anything for a beat. Then he stepped back and held the door open. Junie hesitated, then stepped inside, brushing snow from her boots. She looked around the cabin like she was stepping into a fairy tale she'd only ever drawn before. Her gaze landed on Boone, and her face broke into a grin. "He found you," she whispered. Cal frowned. "You know this dog?" "Not really," she said, setting the drawing down on the edge of a side table. "He's been around. I see him sometimes at the tree line. I always figured he was looking for something." Cal picked up the drawing. It showed a large dog breathing fire, not angry, but warm, onto a smaller pup who looked up with wide, grateful eyes. Above them was a lantern hanging from a tree branch. Inside it, instead of a flame, was a red heart. For the first time in years, Cal felt the sting of tears behind his eyes. He blinked them away. "Can I sit with him?" Junie asked softly, motioning to the puppy. Cal nodded. She perched carefully on the edge of the couch, setting her mittens on her lap, and leaning close to Nico, though she didn't yet know his name. Her voice, when she spoke again, was barely a breath. "I think his name is Nico." Cal looked at her surprised. "I don't know why," she added, shrugging. "It just feels right." From behind them, Boone let out a quiet breath, almost like agreement. They sat there for a while in silence. Cal busied himself with preparing a makeshift hydration mix from old honey and warmed snow water, something he'd done years ago with stranded fawns. He fed Nico drop by drop using a teaspoon, watching as the tiny tongue twitched to life and lapped instinctively. Junie didn't speak again until Boone rose from his spot and walked over to rest his chin gently on her knee. She scratched his ear without hesitation, as if they had known each other their whole lives. "I gotta go," she said eventually, standing up. "Papa doesn't like me gone long in snow." Cal walked her to the door. "I'll bring more drawings," she said, eyes bright with something that looked a lot like hope. "If that's okay." Cal gave a faint smile. "Yeah, that's okay." She disappeared into the white with a little wave, and the cabin door shut behind her. Back inside, Boone had settled beside the fireplace, now lying closer to the pup than before. Nico shifted slightly in his sleep, one tiny paw pressing against Boone's foreleg. Cal stood watching them both. The room was quiet, except for the fire's soft hiss and the slow beat of something awakening inside his chest. By the third day, the wind had returned, carving sharp edges into the drifts that wrapped around Cal Morrigan's cabin like a frozen tide. The temperature had dipped below 10 degrees, and the pine trees moaned quietly beneath the pressure of snow-packed limbs. Inside, the fire roared higher, fed with seasoned wood from the old birch Cal had felled back in September. It was the kind of cold that made the walls crack at night and the breath cloud indoors. But it didn't matter. Nico had a pulse now. And that was everything. The puppy still lay curled in his makeshift nest on the couch, but his condition had changed. His breathing had grown shallow again, his little body trembling with fever, and the bite wound on his paw had begun to swell, red, angry, and slick with infection. Despite Cal's careful cleaning and homemade hydration, Nico's temperature refused to stabilize. That morning, as he pressed a hand gently to the puppy's side and felt the heat rolling off in waves, Cal came to a decision he had dreaded for years. He reached for the satellite phone buried in the bottom drawer of his desk. It took him 3 tries to press the number. He hadn't spoken to Sloane Halperin in nearly 2 years. Sloane answered on the second ring, her voice as clipped and direct as ever. Halperin. Cal cleared his throat. "Hey, it's me." A beat, then a sharp inhale. "Jesus Christ, Cal. You still alive?" "Yeah, then this must be the apocalypse." Cal gave a tired laugh. "Not yet. I need a favor." She was silent for a moment. "Talk. There's a pup. He's in bad shape, bite wound fever, maybe sepsis. I don't have what I need here." And he hesitated. "You remember a golden named Boone." Another pause. "Then you're telling me Boone found you. He's here, brought the pup." "Well, I'll be damned." Her voice dropped an octave, something more personal blooming beneath the sarcasm. "Give me an hour." Sloane Halperin had been with the Forest Service for 15 years, and it showed. She was 41, tall and rangy, with windburned cheeks and sharp green eyes that missed nothing. Her dirty blonde hair was always tied in a no-nonsense braid, and she wore the same battered ranger coat every winter regardless of the growing holes in the cuffs. People in town saw her as no-nonsense brusque and probably too smart for the job. But Cal knew better. Sloane had once dreamed of veterinary school of wildlife conservation on the national level. But her mother's stroke when Sloane was 23 had clipped those wings fast. She stayed in Elk Ridge to care for the family trading ambition for duty and never once complained. She arrived in 45 minutes, her government-issued SUV carving a slow path up the icy slope. Boone, who had been dozing near the hearth, lifted his head long before the vehicle crested the bend. Cal opened the door before she knocked. Sloane stepped in with the cold curling behind her snowflakes, dusting her shoulders. Her eyes scanned the room. Boone the fire, the bundle of towels on the couch, then landed on Cal. "You look like hell," she said simply. "You always did have a way with words." Without waiting for permission, she stripped off her gloves and coat and knelt beside Nico. Cal handed her the flashlight and thermometer without a word. She worked quickly, checking vitals, examining the bite. "This is bad," she muttered. "Worse than I thought. Might be from a wild dog. Or worse." "What's worse than a wild dog?" Cal asked, watching her face carefully. Sloane looked up. "People." They exchanged a glance, one full of years neither dared speak aloud. Boone lay down beside the couch now, his head on his paw's tail still. When Sloane reached to stroke behind his ear, he let out a low whine. It was a rare sound, one Cal hadn't heard since Boone arrived. "You remember that avalanche," she said quietly. "I never forgot it." Sloane sat back on her heels. Boone was with Beth's team. She was in the second sled. He was leading. He felt it before any of us did, but it was already too late. Cal didn't answer. He didn't need to. "I've been tracking him since," she continued. "He vanished the winter after. Some said he walked off into the ridge to die, but I think she glanced at the puppy, then back at Cal. He was still looking for something to save." Cal stared at Boone, who was now licking Nico's paw with gentle rhythmic care. Then maybe he found it. Sloane stood brushing off her jeans. "I have antibiotics in the truck. IV fluids. I can rig a line here if you help." They moved, as a unit, sliding into old rhythms without question. Cal held Nico steady, while Sloane inserted the needle. They rehydrated him slowly, the golden glow of the fire reflecting in the puppy's trembling fur. "I thought I buried this part of myself," Cal said finally. "Thought I could just walk away from all of it." "You didn't bury it," Sloane replied, adjusting the drip. "You just hid it in grief. That's not the same thing." The cabin fell quiet again save for the soft ticking of the heater and the occasional creak of settling wood. Outside, the snow had started again, gentle this time, like a hush across the trees. Sloane packed up slowly. You need to keep the wound clean. Keep the fluids going. And if the fever breaks in the next 12 hours, he's got a shot. And if it doesn't, she looked at Cal. Then at least he had someone. At the door, she paused. You gonna be okay? Cal didn't answer immediately. He looked at Boone, at Nico, at the drawing still pinned on the mantel with a wooden clothespin. I'm trying, he said. That's enough for now, she replied, and was gone. The snow didn't stop for 2 days. It fell in silence, blanketing the ridge in a stillness that swallowed every sound, but the steady crackle of firewood and the occasional creak of the cabin's old beams. Cal Morgan moved slowly through the house, his boots leaving dark prints on the wooden floor as he carried more towels to Nico's corner. The puppy was still weak, but the fever had broken during the night. He slept now in longer stretches, breathing calmly, limbs twitching in the kind of dreams only animals know. Boone remained nearby, always watching. The old retriever had shifted his post from the door to the hearth, laying with his front paws crossed, his white-flecked muzzle resting between them. He didn't demand anything, didn't bark or beg, just observed. Sometimes when Nico stirred, Boone would lift his head and lick the pup's ear once before settling again, as if signaling, "You're still here. Keep going." It was mid-morning when Cal noticed the envelope. It had been slipped under the front door edges, damp with melted snow, the paper folded carefully and tied with a blue yarn string. His name, just Mr. Morgan, was written in large looping handwriting in pink marker. He unwrapped it without sitting down. Inside was a single piece of drawing paper. The sketch showed a cabin drawn in rough brown crayon surrounded by tall pine trees. In the foreground was a man, tall, thin, with a long coat and sad eyes, kneeling beside 2 dogs. One big, one small. Above them words were written in childlike scrawl, "Don't be afraid to love again." Cal stood staring at it for a long time. Junie Bell. Of course it was her. Junie had not come in person this time, likely kept home by the snow. But even from a distance, she seemed to know the weight of the silence that clung to Cal's shoulders. He set the paper on the table beside the firewood bin and sat down in his armchair, fingers tented beneath his chin. For a moment the walls felt closer than usual. He hadn't expected the letter to shake him so deeply. But there it was, an invitation wrapped in innocence, not asking for anything, just offering something freely. The girl had a gift for seeing things most people looked past. Perhaps because she'd already lost more than most children her age. Perhaps because no one had taught her yet that grief was something to hide. Later that day, Sloane returned not in uniform, but in jeans, a black parka, and a snow-stained wool cap that made her look younger than she was. Her face was tight with concern, but her hands moved with ease as she entered and brushed snow from her sleeves. "Got your message," she said without ceremony. "I brought the scanner." From the canvas bag slung over her shoulder, she pulled out a small veterinary-grade microchip reader. It beeped once as she passed it over Nico's shoulder. A second pass over his neck gave a dull beep and a flash of numbers on the screen. Bingo Sloane muttered, frowning. She knelt beside the pup, careful not to startle him. This chip's registered to a kennel downstate. Not a licensed breeder, not even close. They were cited for violations a few years ago, overcrowding, no records, neglect. Place got shut down, but dogs went missing before the feds arrived. Cal's brow darkened. So he's a stray from a busted puppy mill. Or someone dumped him when things got hot. Could have been born after the shutdown and unregistered litter. Boone let out a faint huff from his place by the hearth. Sloane glanced at him, then at Cal. "You're going to have to report it," she said quietly. I know you'd rather keep this off the books, but they'll ask questions when he turns up again. Better if it comes from you." Cal nodded slowly. "Yeah, you're right." After she'd scanned the chip, Sloane stayed a while longer. Not for any official reason. She made tea in Cal's chipped enamel kettle, fed Boone a chunk of jerky from her coat pocket, and then stood near the window watching the snow. "You know," she said, "I've been thinking about Junie." Cal looked up. "She's the one who's been leaving those drawings, right?" He nodded. "She's smart, intuitive, too much for a kid her age, probably. It might help to give her something to focus on." Cal tilted his head. "What are you suggesting?" Sloane turned from the window. "Teach her. Show her what you used to do. Animal care, first aid, the basics. If anyone could pass that on, it's you." Cal blinked. The thought felt strange, off-key, in a song he hadn't sung in years. "You think her grandfather would be okay with that? He's the one who told me she keeps drawing your cabin," Sloane said with a shrug. "He's worried about her, but he trusts her instincts, same as I do." That afternoon, after Sloane left, Cal stood on the porch with the letter from Junie clutched in one hand. The sky was pale gray, the air thin and dry. He walked to the edge of the clearing and looked down the slope where a footpath curved out of view. Then he called out into the trees, "You can come by tomorrow if you want." His voice didn't echo, but something about the way the wind shifted felt like a reply. The next day she came. Junie arrived with a scarf wrapped twice around her neck and a canvas tote bag slung over one shoulder. Inside were notebooks, colored pencils, and a book titled "Animals Who Heal with a Frayed Spine," and several pages dog-eared. She didn't say much at first, just smiled, patted Boone on the head, and sat cross-legged on the rug beside Nako, who blinked at her and yawned. "Is he better?" she asked. "He's on the mend," Cal replied, "but it'll take time." He pulled up a wooden stool beside her and handed her a diagram of a dog's skeletal structure, printed years ago, but still legible. "You want to learn?" he asked. Junie's eyes lit up. "Yes, very much. Then we start here," Cal said, "bones first." The last of the snow had begun to melt in soft patches along the southern slope of Elk Ridge. Pine needles poked through the crust of winter, and the air, while still crisp, no longer bit with the same severity. It was March now, or close enough. The firewood pile had shrunk to its last few logs, and Cal Morgan's cabin smelled faintly of thawing earth-wet bark and the fading ashes of long, silent nights. Nico was a different creature now. The once trembling pup had grown stronger, steadier. His coat had thickened into a sleek, snowy white, and the red swelling in his paw was long gone, leaving behind a scar no bigger than a sunflower seed. He still limped just slightly on colder days, but he had discovered joy in movement, bounding awkwardly through the clearing, chasing his own tail, barking at birds he couldn't reach. Junie Bell visited every afternoon riding in on a beat-up red sled, pulled by a rope tied around her waist. Her cheeks were wind-burned, her braids unruly, and her voice full of questions. She had notebooks now, ones Cal had given her filled with sketches, observations, and little poems about Boone Nico and the forest around them. She was a fast learner, eager, kind. But change had a way of knocking, even when you didn't invite it. That morning, Cal had sat on the porch, sipping weak coffee from a thermos, when Boone stood up from the edge of the clearing and began walking slow, deliberate, without a glance backward. Boone hadn't strayed far in weeks, but this was different. This was purposeful. Cal knew it immediately. By the time Junie arrived, pulling her sled with Nico perched proudly inside it, Boone was already at the tree line waiting. "Is it time?" she asked quietly. Cal looked at her. The little girl who had once left crayon drawings like whispers on his porch now stood with her shoulders straighter, her voice steadier. Grief had given her depth. Hope had given her language. Yes, he said, it's time. They packed only what was necessary: some dried meat, a first aid kit, a lightweight blanket. Sloan had given Cal directions weeks ago, marked on a hand-drawn map with red pencil safe zone. Former trail dog habitat. No traps, no poachers, no noise. She had circled an area near the southern ravine, a place deep enough to go unnoticed, wild enough to belong to those who didn't belong anywhere else. Boone led the way, tail raised like a banner, his gait steady despite the stiffness in his hind legs. Cal carried the bag. Junie walked beside Nico, who trotted without a leash, staying close but not hesitant. He sniffed everything: tree trunks, fox prints, old fallen feathers, as though mapping the world before it could disappear again. It took them most of the day. The trail narrowed near a ledge marked by 3 leaning aspens. Beyond it, the forest deepened into shadow, even in daylight. Here, bird calls became distant echoes. Snow softened into moss and pine needles. Boone stopped at the edge of a small glade, no more than 20 feet across, where the light filtered down like golden threads through old green boughs. And then, just like that, Boone sat down. Nico looked at him, tilted his head, then padded forward into the clearing. He sniffed the air, ears twitching, then gave one short bark. A reply came not from Boone, but from within the trees, a soft, low yip. Another. Then silence. Cal knelt beside Junie. She clutched the edge of her coat, eyes wide. "He hears them," she whispered. "I know," Cal said. Nico walked farther into the clearing. Another bark, higher this time, young and curious. From the thickets on the far side, 2 shapes emerged. Dogs thin, but not starving, fur tangled, but not diseased. They paused when they saw Boone, then Nico, then the 2 humans. One stepped forward, an older husky mix with one clouded eye. She gave a low chuff. Nico turned back once. Just once. Then he ran toward them, not out of fear, but like a child finding siblings he had only dreamed of. Boone stood, gave a single nod toward the pack, and then turned, not toward Cal, not toward Junie, but toward the north slope. Without a sound, he walked away. Junie didn't move until Boone disappeared behind a curve in the trees. When she spoke, her voice cracked. "Will he come back? I don't think so," Cal said gently. "Why not? Because some hearts are meant to roam. His work here is done." They stood for a while longer, watching Nico tumble and play, already becoming one of them, one of the wild. Then, as the sun dipped low and the cold returned, they made their way back. That night, the cabin was quiet. Cal built a smaller fire than usual. Junie, curled up in the armchair with a wool blanket draped over her shoulders, fell asleep with Boone's photo between her fingers. It was the only one they had taken by Sloan the day Boone had first arrived, frozen frame and all. The next morning, Cal stepped outside with his coffee and stopped short. There, on the porch, neatly arranged beside the door, one smooth river stone, pale gray, with a red streak across it, 3 pine cones, and a single piece of birch bark with a paw print pressed into the snow. Cal smiled, slowful. He picked up the stone, turned it over in his hand, then looked out toward the edge of the woods. He didn't say anything. He didn't have to. Sometimes the greatest miracles don't come in lightning bolts or grand gestures, but in quiet footsteps across the snow, in the warmth of a child's drawing, or in the silent trust of a dog who asks for nothing and gives everything. This story reminds us that healing doesn't always happen overnight. It arrives softly through kindness, courage, and the decision to love again. Maybe Boone didn't just find Cal by accident. Maybe he was sent. Maybe in that frozen wilderness God whispered to one of his creatures and said, "There's still work to do." And maybe we too are being called to protect, to nurture, to return the fire to the world around us. In a world that often feels cold and distant, may this story remind you that compassion still has the power to melt even the deepest snow. If this story touched your heart, share it with someone who needs hope. Leave a comment below and type Amen. If you believe that God sends us messengers in all forms, even those with 4 paws. Don't forget to like, comment, and subscribe to our channel for more stories of faith healing and the miracles hidden in everyday life. May God bless you and keep you warm wherever you are.